The calendars show August 2nd, 1909, just 1 month before the outbreak of World War II. The Jewish physicist Albert Einstein had learned that German physicists had succeeded in splitting the uranium atom. It was not too difficult to envision that this atomic energy could be turned into a nuclear bomb. For this reason, Albert Einstein and a group of scientists wrote a letter to the then American President Roosevelt about this danger. In the letter, he warned that Nazi Germany was researching atomic bombs and was very close to discovering atomic energy. He wrote that America should start the work, otherwise it could be a catastrophe if Germany could produce an atomic bomb. But this letter was not taken seriously by America. Until 2 years later, when the Japanese, Germany's allies, attacked the American port of Pearl Harbor. This unexpected attack resulted in America's de facto entry into the Second World War. In response, American President Roosevelt took Albert Einstein's letter seriously and began work on the atomic bomb. It was decided that the atomic bomb would only be produced as a deterrent against the Germans, so the United States launched its own nuclear program, the Manhattan Project. The world's foremost physicists and engineers were involved. Many Jewish scientists who had escaped the massacres of the Nazis were part of this team. Robert Oppenheimer, the successful physicist who would later be known as the father of the atomic bomb, was put in charge of the project. A huge laboratory was set up in Los Alamos, a desolate desert on the borders of New Mexico. Thousands of scientists began non-stop work on the atomic bomb. Having lost in 1942 at the Battle of Midway, the Japanese army decided to develop a defensive policy in the Pacific against America. It would begin to expand into the Southwest Pacific and thus build a defensive ring around the places it captured. The Japanese soon managed to dominate Australia and New Zealand, cutting off their lines of communication with America. The American army, on the other hand, pursued a full-on offensive policy against Japan. They would reach Japan not directly, but through the islands, a tactic they called island hopping. America's first target was Guadalcanal, which was strategically very important. If Guadalcanal was taken, it would dominate the Solomon Islands, secure Australia, and provide a base for further attacks. This island was critical for both sides. While the American army was preparing for war, an American reconnaissance mission detected the construction of a Japanese airfield on the south coast of Guadalcanal. This made the situation even more critical. This Japanese airfield was a major threat to America, so the American fleet immediately landed on the shores of Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942. American planes bombarded the island, while American infantry attacked Japanese troops from the ground. Soon the Japanese airport under construction was captured. The construction was completed by the Americans and named Henderson Field in honor of the naval aviator killed in the Battle of Midway. The Japanese insisted on refusing to surrender the island. Japanese attacks on the island continued for 6 months, but the American army managed to defend the island. By the end of the war, the Japanese had lost more than 20,000 soldiers, 38 ships, and 683 aircraft. The American army lost 7,000 soldiers, 29 ships, and 653 fighter planes. Thus, the next target of the American army, which dominated the Solomon Islands, was the Mariana Islands. Taking these islands would break the Japanese defense wall. Their plan was to establish bases on the islands and bombard Japan with long-range aircraft and the Philippines with fighters. To this end, a large American fleet sailed for Saipan Island. The Japanese knew what would happen if they lost the Mariana Islands. The defense units on the islands were ordered to defend with all their might. an armada was sent for reinforcements and supplies. Arriving on Saipan Island, the American Navy bombarded the island with 15 warships. In the morning, the soldiers landed on the beach. Japanese forces met them. The American infantry advanced, while the Japanese defended the island with ambushes until reinforcements arrived. But the reinforcements Japan was expecting had been defeated by the American Navy in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. In this defeat, the Japanese lost 3 aircraft carriers and hundreds of aircraft. Saipan's hopes for reinforcements and supplies were thus destroyed, and they were left alone on the island. The Japanese had nowhere to retreat to. They realized they could not win the war. Despite the difficult and desperate conditions, the Japanese soldiers would not give up. On the last day of the war, some 4,000 Japanese soldiers attacked American troops in a banzai offensive. It was time for a last stand. In defense of the island, Saipan's civilian population wore bombs and detonated them among the American soldiers. Nearly 4,000 soldiers and 1,000 civilians fought to the death for Japan. Almost all Japanese soldiers were killed that day. Generals and commanders committed suicide by committing seppuku to avoid surrender. Nearly 30,000 Japanese soldiers were killed in this battle, while the American army suffered 3,000 dead and 10,000 wounded. With the American capture of the Mariana Islands, the Japanese defensive wall was broken. The plan was proceeding as it should. America began bombing Japan with its long-range B-62S aircraft, while its short-range fighters bombed the Philippines. By December 1944, a major development was taking place in the European arm of the American army. The Germans were helpless and powerless against America. By January 1st, 1945, the Germans began to retreat under American and Soviet pressure. Their surrender was imminent. But the Japanese were still continuing the war and not surrendering. The long-range BXX planes taking off from the Mariana Islands were suffering losses on the way back due to the long distance. In order to bomb Japan with fewer casualties, America needed to get closer to Japan. For this reason, American forces set their sights on islands close to the Japanese mainland. Once taken, these islands would be used as a base for emergency landings so that fighters could cover the bombers. The target was first and foremost the island of Iwo Jima, forever etched in the memory of the Americans. This island, about 100 kilometers south of Tokyo, was the last wall for the Japanese. The Japanese had anticipated the American attack on this island and had begun their preparations months in advance. The commander who would lead the defense was Lieutenant General Kuribayashi. Kuribayashi knew how devastating the loss of Iwo Jima would be, but he also knew that it could not be defended against the Americans with the 23,000 men at his disposal. So his plan was to inflict as much damage as possible on the American army. The entrenched garrisons had been fortified by building complex networks of tunnels and bunkers. The Japanese soldiers made an oath to engage in battle until their last breath. Their objective was to eliminate at least 10 adversaries before meeting their own demise. The American Navy's large-mass battle belts and aircraft belts began bombarding the coastal defenses. This bombardment continued for a month, but it was not enough to diminish the fighting power of the Japanese soldiers hidden in bunkers. In February 19, 1945, a total of 70,000 Marines from America successfully carried out a landing operation. As the Marines arrived, they believed that the previous bombing had succeeded, as there were no individuals in the vicinity. Until they fell into Japanese traps. When the American army had advanced far enough, Kuribayashi gave the order to fire. Japanese soldiers started utilizing machine guns in the hills and valleys, unleashing rounds of gunfire. Snipers targeted the commanders. Japanese soldiers emerged from the tunnels and attacked to the death. American soldiers burned the bunkers with their fire engines, and no one showed mercy. No one backed down. The next day, the American infantry captured the first airstrip on the island. When Mount Suribachi was captured, the soldiers planted an American flag there. It was at this moment that the famous photograph representing America in the Second World War was taken. The photo was first published in the Sunday newspaper on February 25, 1945. The island was now split in two. The Japanese had lost most of their army. The surviving Japanese soldiers continued to attack in unimaginable ways. They were pulling grenades and jumping on American soldiers with grenades in their hands and trying to take American soldiers to their deaths with them. When the island was completely captured, only 216 Japanese prisoners remained alive. More than 21,000 Japanese soldiers had been killed by the Americans. There were about 6,800 dead American soldiers. There were nearly 20,000 wounded and 500 missing, not a piece of which was ever found. While the final battles were being fought on Iwo Jima, another arm of the United States was preparing a large task force to invade the island of Okinawa. This was one of the largest islands bordering the Japanese mainland. It was to be used as a base for air attacks on Japan and as a staging area before the American army entered mainland Japan. E-2 Admiral Raymond had under his command nearly 500,000 men and personnel and 213,000 naval personnel. Japanese General Mitsuru Ushijima had under his command 100,000 men. This was a much larger number than at the battles of Iwo Jima and Saipan. The battle here was to be the biggest battle of the Pacific War. The Japanese general decided to use the same tactics on Okinawa as on Iwo Jima. This was an interesting choice, because these tactics had proved to be demonstrably inadequate and had led to failure. The island was thin and long and difficult to defend. Only the limestone hills at its southernmost tip would have worked. Ushijima deployed the bulk of his forces in the hilly area and on a defense line that ran from Naha, the island's largest town, across the island. Some of the forces were stationed on the Motobu Peninsula. The Japanese had lost most of their experienced and skilled pilots during the battles in the Pacific, so they resorted to a new tactic. This strategy was called kamikaze, or divine wind. Inexperienced pilots, trained only in airmanship and airplane handling, would fearlessly dive into American ships with their planes loaded with 250 kilograms of explosives and undertake suicide missions. As on Iwo Jima, the American Navy and Air Forces launched a heavy bombing attack on the island. The main assault began on April 1st, when American infantry landed on the west coast of Okinawa. Soldiers and military personnel expected the landing on the beach to be a worse massacre, but surprisingly, the expected strength of Japanese troops was not there. Troops, tanks, ammunition and supplies were landed almost effortlessly within hours. Meanwhile, in addition to the American Navy, the British also arrived in Okinawa with 4 aircraft carriers and 1 warship. Despite their naval superiority, the Americans were uneasy about continued Japanese air attacks. They were even afraid. American troops moved quickly into the interior of the island, capturing Kadena and Yontan airfields. Another American contingent was also moving north. As the American troops moved inland, they began to wonder when and where they would finally meet enemy resistance. What they didn't know was that the Imperial Japanese Army had them right where they wanted them. Finally, General Ushijima ordered Japanese troops in the defensive line he had set up in Shuri, a rugged area of southern Okinawa, to open fire on the American soldiers. A fierce ground battle then broke out on the island. On April 6th, the battleship Yamato and Japanese aircraft carriers came to the rescue of the Japanese. Battleships were dropping bombs on the American troops trapped in the Shuri line, while kamikaze planes were crashing into the American fleet at 800 km per hour, inflicting heavy damage. The USS Franklin was so badly hit by the kamikazes that it had to be withdrawn. The American fleet had lost many ships to kamikaze attacks. But the battleship Yamato, the largest battleship built up to that time, was sunk after 4 hours of aerial bombardment by American submarines. The sinking of the battleship Yamato ended the Japanese Navy's presence there. The Japanese infantry tried to hold the enemy at the bottom of the hill, but not for long. The Japanese defense line was breached by the Americans on April 24th. Fierce fighting was also taking place in the north of the island. The American Navy was badly worn out by the incessant kamikaze attacks. Nevertheless, the American army advanced rapidly in the south, gradually pushing the Japanese army back towards the Kian Peninsula. The American Navy then landed south of the island and bombarded the retreating Japanese army. The Air Force was constantly attacking, not even allowing the Japanese to escape. By then, the Japanese had lost half their army. Then a heavy rain began to fall on Okinawa. Torrential rain poured down on the corpses, turning the island into a bloodbath. It left the soldiers covered in mud and halted their advance. The Japanese had no more ground to fight on. The Japanese soldiers believed that the Americans took no prisoners and tortured and killed those they captured. Therefore, when they realized that they could not win the war for sure, mass suicides began in the Japanese army. By the end of this 2.5-month war, the Americans had faced a total of 3,000 kamikaze attacks. These attacks had caused serious naval casualties, but they also exhausted Japanese air power. By the end of the war, nearly 4,000 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. The Japanese had virtually destroyed their own air force in the process. In addition, more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers had been killed. In the American army, 12,500 soldiers were killed and some 39,000 wounded. It was a victory that came at a great cost to America. At the end of this war, there was a lot of news in the United States and in Europe. In Europe, Nazi Germany had surrendered definitively, and Adolf Hitler had committed suicide. Soldiers had inspected the German laboratories, but it turned out that they had given up before they started work on the atomic bomb. In the United States, President Roosevelt had died and was replaced by Truman. While all this was happening, developments were taking place in the Los Alamos Desert in New Mexico. A mysterious work that former American President Roosevelt had started as a defense against Nazi Germany, but which led to events that would shake the world, was about to be completed under the leadership of Oppenheimer. No one knew what such a bomb could do, not even the people who built it. After more than $2 billion had been spent, the work on the atomic bomb had borne its first fruit. President Truman was following this work closely. At 5:30 on April 16, 1945, the first test of the atomic bomb, known as the Trinity test, was to take place. It was to be detonated on a steel hilltop, surrounded by scientific equipment and monitored by scientists and a few officials from bunkers 9 kilometers away. And when the order came, nature would face the destructive power of the atomic bomb with the first nuclear explosion on Earth. Those who saw the violence of the atomic bomb waited with terrified eyes to see what would happen next. A tiny bomb promised colossal destruction. The Battle of Okinawa had shown the extent to which the Japanese could defend their homeland. The fact that America had suffered so many casualties in the capture of a small island like Okinawa raised the prospect of far greater casualties in an invasion of the Japanese mainland. Such a struggle could have resulted in the loss of between 500,000 and 1 million American soldiers. Although American commanders thought these numbers were exaggerated, they knew one thing: the Japanese would put up a much more fierce and determined resistance than usual in defense of their mainland. The Japanese resistance in Okinawa was an important proof of this idea. Thus, the outcome in Okinawa influenced the decision of the American headquarters a month later: the use of the atomic bomb instead of an invasion campaign. Two atomic bombs loaded on trucks left the laboratory. It was then loaded onto the Indianapolis on July 16, 1945. The ship reached the island of Tinian on July 26, 1945. Japan would either surrender or be destroyed. On the same day, American President Truman called on Japan to surrender. Otherwise, he warned that there would be great destruction in the country. Japanese Prime Minister Suzuki was not aware of the existence of the atomic bomb. For this reason, he did not want to accept the Potsdam Declaration imposed on him. In the hope of getting better peace terms from the Allies by threatening to resist to the end, he responded with mokusatsu, meaning no comment. The translators of the day translated this as a contemptuous refusal. President Truman then ordered the atomic bombing of Japan. The Americans were now talking about which city to drop the atomic bomb on. Tokyo had already been leveled by airplanes. The first cities chosen were Kyoto, Hiroshima, Yokohama, and Kokura. But then it was decided on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the southern part of the country. Kyoto was removed from the list at the last minute because of its historical and cultural heritage. On the night of August 6, 1945, a US Army B-29 bomber took off for the industrial city of Hiroshima with a 5-ton atomic bomb called Little Boy. At that time, Hiroshima was silent. People were going about their business and children were sleeping. Suddenly, a huge fire exploded. Eyes were dazzled, ears deafened. Within seconds there were burning bodies and a city completely destroyed. The mushroom aftermath of the explosion horrified even the B-29 crew, who looked at the blast point through special goggles. An area of 13 square kilometers was completely destroyed. 120,000 people, mostly civilians, were killed instantly by the blast. More than 500,000 civilians died or were crippled by radiation-induced diseases. Then, on August 3rd and 9th, another B-29 bomber took off from the Mariana Islands and headed for the city of Nagasaki. The 4,100 kilogram Fat Man atomic bomb struck the city of Nagasaki. Because the city was protected by mountains, the impact of the explosion caused less damage than in Hiroshima. Even houses 8 kilometers away from where the bomb fell were destroyed. Of the city's population of 270,000, 75,000 were killed immediately by the bomb and 80,000 died from severe burns. Tens of thousands of civilians suffered for years from the long-lasting after-effects of high levels of radiation. The Japanese people were terrified by the impact of these atomic bombs. People started to leave their cities for fear that other cities would also be bombed. Japan was literally exhausted. Faced with the danger of total annihilation, Japan agreed to surrender unconditionally on August 14, 1945. Thus, World War II officially came to an end. The Americans had no idea that Russian spies had already delivered all the information about the Manhattan Project to Moscow. Stalin had already ordered a high-speed nuclear development program to begin. When the Soviet Union conducted its first atomic bomb test in August 1949, it thought it had achieved a balance of nuclear power. But by that time, America had 298 atomic bombs ready for use. The world did not realize that it was drifting towards a completely different kind of war.